Thanks everyone for being here. I just want to note that Spanish interpretation is available for folks on this Zoom call who need it. Just choose that language down in the interpretation button on Zoom. My name is Will Jamil Wilchko. I'm the director of the California Trade Justice Coalition, and I'll be moderating this important webinar. Now, before I introduce our amazing speakers, I want to give you folks some context. As a lot of us are seeing, there's an increasing number of people in the United States getting vaccinated against COVID-19. Just this week here in California on June 15th, we announced that we were removing most restrictions and reopening. However, the pandemic is far from over. The majority of people in South America and the global South are not expected to have access to the vaccine for years unless global production is increased dramatically. This means more variants will emerge, potentially those that are vaccine resistant, which could restart the pandemic all over again for everyone. Over 12,000 people around the world are dying every day due to COVID, and that's just the verified number. The number is probably much higher than that. The governments of India and South Africa proposed an emergency waiver of, quote, trade-related intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization, which is known as the TRIPS waiver. And this is a critical first step to enabling vaccines and treatments to be produced in as many places as possible, as quickly as possible. Big Pharma has been opposing it from the beginning. Most of the big pharmaceutical companies behind these vaccines, who got a lot of public investment, by the way, want to gouge each country individually. They want to get as much as they can from every country they can. However, after months of organizing and pressure from civil society organizations, along with pressure from millions of people, the Biden administration announced that the United States would support the TRIPS waiver. This was a huge victory, but there's still so much work that's needed to be done to ensure that the TRIPS waiver happens. Now, in the past few weeks, a large number of countries have announced their support for the TRIPS waiver, joining the over 100 countries that already supported it. But some countries, like Germany, especially Germany, continue to try to obstruct and delay this deal. Now, many of us, myself included, have had to attend Zoom funerals for folks who we lost during COVID, folks we lost because of COVID. Now, I know that it's really difficult to say goodbye to someone you love, but it's even more difficult when it's virtual and you're on a Zoom call, a Zoom funeral with 100 people who are all crying. And that's how people's lives are ending right now. Now, it's unconscionable and it's detestable that countries like Germany, in collusion with Big Pharma, continue to delay a deal that could save millions of lives and millions more from having to mourn their loved ones virtually. The Biden administration and other governments need to increase the pressure on Germany to do the right thing and support a comprehensive TRIPS waiver. Every day of delay means more death, more families pushed into poverty, and more opportunities for COVID variants to develop that could evade the current vaccine and start the pandemic all over again. Now, South America in particular has been ravaged by COVID. And there was a report today in the New York Times that about 1.1 million new coronavirus cases and more than 31,000 deaths were reported last week in the Americas. And most of them were in South American nations where transmission remains out of control and where access to the vaccine remains limited. Now, Colombia set new records for reported deaths 3 days in a row this week, peaking on Tuesday with 599 deaths. Brazil is on track to reach the grim milestone of 500,000 total deaths in the next week or two, and is reporting more than 70,000 new cases a day on average. We're fortunate right now to be joined by experts from both of those countries who are longtime advocates in the fight for access to medicines. Without them, we wouldn't be where we are today in the campaign for the TRIPS waiver. Their leadership and expertise is truly inspirational, and I'm really honored to be here with them today. So I'll quickly introduce you to them, and then I'll invite each of them to share their work with you. After they share more about their work, we'll open it up to some questions for the panelists, and then we'll wrap. So first speaker that'll be up is Felipe Carvalho. He's with Doctors Without Borders Brazil, aka MSF. He's a journalist, health activist, and advocacy coordinator at Doctors Without Borders Brazil, with more than 10 years of professional experience in public interest advocacy, communications campaigns, strategic litigation, public policy analysis, project management, training, and lectures. After that, we'll have Dr. Francisco Rossi with Ifarma, Colombia. Trained as a physician and epidemiologist, Dr. Rossi brings extensive international experience through his work on pharmaceutical regulation and health system reforms. He is currently the senior advisor of the Ifarma Foundation, a nonprofit research institute that focuses on medicines access, use, and quality. Francisco also consults with the World Health Organization, Pan American Health Organization, World Bank, and European Union. And then after that, we'll have Arthur Stamolis. Arthur is the executive director of the Citizens Trade Campaign, a national coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, consumer, and human rights organizations working together to improve US trade policy. Arthur's been one of the key leaders in the movement for the campaign to support the TRIPS waiver within the United States, coordinating coalition efforts both nationally and internationally. So with that, I'll start with Felipe.
Thanks a lot, Will, and it's a pleasure to participate. Thanks for the invitation. Good afternoon for everybody watching us at this moment, and also a hello to my colleagues from the session, from the panel. So quickly, just to introduce a little bit more what I have been doing in my position as MSF Access Campaign Coordinator in Brazil and Latin America. We have been basically, since the beginning of the pandemic in March last year, doing different sorts of public campaigning. The first level, we actually tried to push companies not to request any kind of intellectual property over essential health goods like vaccines, diagnostics, drugs. But of course, and as expected, they have refused to do so. They have done the opposite. They have created large webs of complex control over these technologies. And this is one of the main reasons why we are seeing today a huge access crisis when it comes to any kind of important essential tools, from vaccines to masks and ventilators and diagnostics, everything. So we have been, since last October, started to discuss with governments the possibility of this TRIPS waiver, which is the most complete solution we can have at this moment, and something that can be led by governments. So first of all, this is a power balance game, because what we see today is basically that all the power is in the hands of pharmaceutical companies. The power to decide on prices, the power to decide on timelines, on production, on quantities, on which countries get access first, what countries wait to get access. All those decisions are in the hands of a few multinational pharmaceutical companies, and it shouldn't be like that. And the governments have legal tools that they can use at national level, but more importantly, at the global level with this TRIPS waiver. So we have been campaigning quite strongly since last October to spread the word about this possibility, also convince governments to join this initiative. And since October until today, as Will already explained, there have been more than 100 countries that have basically spoke out and shared their support to this initiative. So we are closer than ever to have a negotiation, a true negotiation. And apart from governments, of course, there are also thousands of civil society organizations, affected people, labor unions, different kinds of experts, Nobel laureates, celebrities, everybody. It's also joining forces to ask the same ask, which is, it makes no sense during a pandemic to have monopolies over essential technologies like a vaccine, because this is what creates an unacceptable access crisis. And this is actually something that was expected, because for people like Francisco and myself that have been working in the past years, 10 years, with access to hepatitis C treatments, cancer treatments, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, we have seen this over and over again. Every time we have a monopoly over an essential technology, we have this situation of exclusion of entire populations from their right to health. And this is unacceptable from the beginning. It's a moral failure, as it was called by the head of the World Health Organization. And in the past, what we learned is that there are, of course, some, as we call them, public health flexibilities that the governments can use to overcome this crisis and provide access to people. But they are very slow to provide a response during a pandemic. We need to fight country by country, product by product, and this takes years and years of campaigning and negotiations, and sometimes a lot of people remain without any access until we get a decision like a compulsory license or something like this. So these tools have worked when they were used. The point is that to make sure they are used, we spend a lot of energy. There is a lot of pressure from pharmaceutical companies on governments, so they do not use any public health flexibilities. So now, based on this lesson learned process, we are fighting for the waiver because this is the most complete solution. First, because it includes all countries at the same time. It includes also all technologies. So it's important to emphasize that when we are talking about the waiver, what waiver are we talking about? We believe in the regional proposal made by India and South Africa that includes vaccines, diagnostics, drugs, everything in the scope of the waiver. We are concerned that some countries like the US are mentioning more like a vaccine waiver. This would be a reductionist approach that we don't want to see in the next weeks, because of course people will need treatments as they get in UCI beds, including because many countries are in a very slow process of vaccination. So we will have next waves and a lot of people will get really in a severe stage. So any treatment that come up, we need to make sure it gets to everybody everywhere. So this waiver needs to be inclusive in terms of all technologies. So the US and other countries must not reduce the scope of the original proposal. And also the third level is that this waiver is a solution that includes all countries, all technologies, and all intellectual property potential barriers, because we are not only talking about patents here. When we talk about vaccines, not only patents are the problem, but also trade secrets, which is another kind of intellectual property, and also sometimes copyrights, because there are algorithms involved in the production process for vaccines that are also under copyrights. So there are different intellectual properties that needs to be waived, so we can really share the knowledge that was actually most of it developed with public resources in public institutions. So it's really important to make sure this knowledge reaches everybody, every potential producer. It doesn't make any sense that the knowledge to contain the virus exists, but it is really made scarce by these monopolies. So that's the kind of situation we are trying to address with this proposal of the waiver. So I hope to maybe respond later more about Brazil. This is more an overall comment why we are fighting for the waiver. We think it's really the most complete solution to make sure we get over this inequality that is killing so many people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. I'd like to pass it to Dr. Rossi.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. I have worked a lot with Felipe, so most of the things he mentioned, I share for sure, especially with Felipe. I will try to emphasize some issues that we were working a lot in the past years, as he mentioned, but he didn't emphasize as well as I expected, and as well as I am interested to emphasize. Just to introduce a little bit Ifarma we said in Spanish, is a local organization in Colombia with some experience internationally. And we started to work in the last century, before 2000, before 2000, on especially on rational use of drugs. And we learned before the discussions of access to medicines that the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in a lot of condemnable or not really legal or not elegant behaviors, even in the last century. And the discussions, we have worked a lot with Health Action International on the concept of essential medicines and rational use of drugs. And there were a lot of discussions with pharmaceutical industry about bad behavior in this issue. But because of TRIPS, because of the WTO and the inclusion of intellectual property as a global platform for every country in order to participate in the global trade, intellectual property it's a division in the history of our discussions on medicines. We changed the focus from rational use to access to medicines. And I will state, I think one can say that it was because of intellectual property that we need to talk about access in developing countries. Before this issue, before intellectual property and TRIPS, we have a lot of medicines, we have a lot of problems, but we didn't work in the same way we are working right now on access to medicines. It's a new discussion because of prices, because of intellectual property. And we started with HIV drugs, life-saving medicines, which was at the same time, and we have, there are a lot of histories about that. We have no the time to make this discussion, but remember that we started with life-saving medicines and with intellectual property, which made possible a very interesting thing we were discussing just yesterday in a very special discussion nationally. It's about the fact that right now pharmaceutical industry is creating vaccines that are right now scarcity goods. Vaccines are scarcity goods. And we are discussing about access because they are scarcity. But this is not a natural scarcity, it's an artificial scarcity. And where is the explanation of this scarcity? Intellectual property. So if we need something that solves the problem for everyone, everywhere, as all the people agree every time we discuss that, we need to avoid the scarcity. And there is no way to avoid scarcity if you have the innovation model we have right now, based on intellectual property, but also based on investments, risk investment, risk capitals, special investor everywhere. They are investing in the development of vaccines or medicines or things like that because they expect to have scarcity goods. When scarcity exists, you can put the price you wanted to put. That's it. So the main problem is about scarcity, and the base of scarcity is intellectual property. I wanted to put on the discussion other issue. We have worked a lot in REDLAM, the Latin American network of access to medicines, We work a lot with Felipe and people from Peru, people from Brazil, people from Argentina and Colombia, and of course other places, in a very specific discussion. Developing countries never agreed to apply intellectual property for medicines voluntarily. It was an imposition. And it is a heritage of the colonialism of 2-3 centuries ago. And right now is some kind of colonial scheme to extract richness from the south to the north. Most of the medicines we are discussing right now and vaccines are developed in the north, and the high prices are high prices for the north, and of course are high prices for the south, for huge prices for the south, and are the way to extract richness from the south to the north. So one can understand why the governments of the north are very, very cautelous, very polite, very ambiguous about this discussion, because they are very interested in this business which translates the richness from the south to the north. And we in Red Lamb proposed some years ago to combat intellectual property for medicines, for health goods. And we decided that we are not interested in discuss if compulsory licenses or maybe voluntary licenses or one thing or another. We decided to use a sentence pronounced for one of our activists during the negotiations of free trade agreements. He said sometimes, we will remember intellectual property patents for medicines in the future as with the same moral condemn we remember today slavery, which is a strong sentence, but we believe is exactly real, is absolutely real. And in this issue, we are combining a lot of activities. Ifarma have asked for 3 compulsory licenses in Colombia. ABIA in Brazil have asked for compulsory licenses and worked on that for a long time, and also on the discussion of quality of patents. And in Peru, of course, they asked for a compulsory license. But at the end, our main focus is to eliminate intellectual property measures for health goods. And of course, it is, we are very happy when the discussion right now at WTO is about the waiver, because the waiver is giving us the reason that this is the problem. I have a lot of things to add to this point, but it's very easy to be very enthusiastic, and time is short, so I stop here.
Great, thanks so much for all the insight. I'd like to pass it to Arthur.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Dr. Rossi. Thank you, Will. And thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm mainly going to talk about the role in the United States as part of the global campaign to end vaccine apartheid. And I think that term vaccine apartheid is very appropriate in light of the information already shared in this discussion. Those of us in the United States know, in the US, access to COVID vaccines is increasingly widespread. There's now hard data that shows the more the vaccination rates go up in a given area, the more infection rates are going down. So vaccination is already saving lives here. And it's not just saving lives and preventing illness, it's helping improve local economies. It's also really helping to improve quality of life. I mean, I myself will be visiting my elderly mother for the first time in a year and a half later this month because my family's now fully vaccinated. My teenage daughter will be going back to school in person this fall because she and her teachers have had access to vaccines. And after so much death and so much hardship, things here are, starting to go back to normal because these vaccines work and are working. And so this notion that we as the United States or we as members of a global community would allow this great gift of COVID vaccination to be denied to other nations, it's the height of cruelty. It's the height of selfishness. It's the height of hubris and insanity, really. The fundamental issue here is that not nearly enough vaccines are being produced to meet the global demand, and that rather than coming together across borders to increase that production as quickly as possible, as others have said, there's this artificial scarcity, this created scarcity, because we have these arcane trade rules that actually prevent countries from manufacturing vaccines, from manufacturing treatments, from manufacturing diagnostic tools. Thus far, the world has produced, a little bit over 2 billion vaccine doses when the global need is, roughly 12 billion doses. And there's no widely agreed upon plan whatsoever for increasing that production. And without a plan, by default, you sort of just have this hope that, after the US and after the EU and after other rich nations are vaccinated, well, maybe ongoing production will eventually trickle down and enable low and middle income nations to have access to vaccines. That is a process that's already projected to take years, which is horrific in and of itself. But if, as medical experts and increasingly even the pharmaceutical companies themselves, if, as they increasingly tell us, people are going to actually need annual booster shots, this massive production shortfall isn't just going to be a several-year problem. It could be a forever problem, unless and until we do something about it. So, as others have said, understanding this full well, last October, the governments of South Africa and India introduced this plan at the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive parts of what Will mentioned is the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS. And right now these TRIPS rules at the WTO are requiring countries to enforce pharmaceutical companies' monopolies over vaccines and medications and other medical tools. And there are literally vaccine-making factories in every region of the world, experienced, safe, high quality, well-regulated factories that say they have the capacity to be making vaccines right now. But the companies that hold the intellectual property rights over the vaccines, for reasons that I'm happy to speculate on, they simply won't license these other factories to do so. And so the idea behind the TRIPS waiver is to say to countries, look, you don't need to wait around for Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca's permission. Please go ahead and start producing vaccines and treatments as quickly as you can. It seems like such a small common sense thing. It should have been agreed to instantly. But when the proposal was first made, it was largely considered a pipe dream. And that's because the WTO ostensibly works by consensus, and rich countries, led at that time by the Trump administration, were blocking the proposal. The good news is since October, we've had an election in the US. And, as others have said, after a ton of campaigning by literally hundreds of organizations, literally millions of people around the world, the Biden administration announced last month that it was reversing the US bloc and that it now supports at least a partial TRIPS waiver. This is a huge deal in and of itself, reversing not just bad Trump policy, but really decades of US policy that put pharmaceutical company interests and profits ahead of global health. So, thank you to everyone who made that victory possible, because it's a very, very important initial initial win. And since that US change in position, a lot of other countries have either come out in support of the TRIPS waiver or have at least stopped opposing it. Russia, China, Australia, Japan, many others. And I'm pleased to say, just starting literally today, members of the TRIPS Council at the WTO finally started text-based negotiations on a waiver, something that countries have been blocking for the last 10 months. In this new context, we're pushing the WTO to come to a quick and comprehensive final agreement that can actually start increasing vaccine and treatment production and get shots into people's arms as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, as Will already said, the EU, led by Germany, continues to try to obstruct a final waiver agreement. There's been enough pressure on them that they allowed the negotiations to move forward, but they continue to voice their opposition to a waiver and are instead talking about, well, maybe we'll just put out a statement clarifying existing policies. Policies that were approved 20 years ago and that the past year has shown are completely inadequate to the challenges at hand. And so as activists in the US, we find ourselves in this unusual position. One where absolutely we need to continue urging our own government to press for a fast and comprehensive deal, but where we also need to press European governments, and in particular, German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The other week, there were a handful of demonstrations outside German consulates across the US, including, I know, in San Francisco, organized by Will and the California Trade Justice Coalition. And we heard from our German allies that officials in Berlin and Geneva took notice of those protests. These European officials did not like being in this position where the US is adopting the internationalist position, and Germany and the EU are viewed as the isolationist bad guys on the global stage. And so, as these TRIPS waiver negotiations proceed, they're trying to reach an initial deal prior to the next WTO General Council meeting on July 21st, about a month from now. And so we need to keep building the pressure on the EU and especially especially Germany. If Germany were to come on board, we could reach a TRIPS waiver agreement within weeks and at least see some increased vaccine production within months of that, and hopefully exponentially more production over the year that follows. But if Germany chooses to fight South Africa and India over every line of waiver text, they could easily drag out the talks forever. And I say that from experience as a fair trade campaigner who has seen things like that done on our side to block bad corporate proposals of the WTO. Those talks can drag on for decades if people allow that to happen. And so we need to continue to isolate Germany, call them out as the bad actors that they're being on this issue. That's going to help our allies in Europe move the EU towards a waiver. It'll also give the Biden administration the cover it needs to keep pushing for a fast and hopefully robust agreement in the face of the European and big pharma opposition. And let me just conclude by saying very concretely, first, that Angela Merkel is supposed to be visiting the US next month. People are already planning a series of demonstrations against vaccine apartheid at many of the 44 German consular offices across the US. We're going to need everyone's help with that. If you're in California, please reach out to Will. I will put some info in the chat about a meeting happening next week for those who are interested in getting further involved. And then second, we're going to be asking our members of Congress to write EU and German officials in support of the TRIPS waiver, and we're going to need your help reaching out to your elected officials as part of that effort. So I just want to thank everyone for your past activism in this area. It is making a big difference, but thank you especially for the difference you're going to make in the days and weeks ahead, because there's a lot more work that's needed to, number one, pass this waiver and then do all the other things that are needed to end the pandemic.
Thanks so much, Arthur. If folks have questions, please feel free to paste them in the chat on social media or on Zoom. We've got a few questions already. So I'll start with one that I think is probably appropriate for Felipe. What does it look like right now on the ground in Brazil? How would the TRIPS waiver impact things there? That's for you, Felipe.
Okay, thank you. Well, so the situation in Brazil, as you may know, it's quite severe right now. We are close to 500,000 deaths. and we are in a daily death rate of around 3,000 people per day. So, and when it comes to vaccination, we can say vaccination in Brazil has been quite slow. Only if we take the priority groups in Brazil, they account for 36% of the population, including the elderly, the health professionals, but also different professional categories that have been considered also priority groups, also vulnerable populations. And so far, we have reached around 12% of people vaccinated with the 2 doses. So we are even quite far from reaching the priority group alone. And the whole population, it will take, of course, much more time. And the figures for Latin America are also quite bad, I would say. There are some projections by the economists that say only in 2023 that there will be widespread vaccination in the region. But some countries like Honduras may take 10 to 11 years to vaccinate the whole population. And in some African countries, there are some calculations that say in the current pace, they would take 50 years to vaccinate the whole population. But in Brazil, of course, there are many problems related to monopolies. So for example, last year we had a major problem with diagnostics from actually it's a US-based company called Cepheid. They have a very good point of care molecular test that is quite reliable. And in Brazil, it would make a lot of difference in contexts like indigenous populations, remote areas. But basically the price was too high. The company was offering a very high price to Brazil, and also they didn't have actually the quantities to deliver to the country. So Brazil gave up on buying those last year, thanks to the high prices that are also resulting from the monopoly this company has. And until today, the Brazilian diagnostic strategy is quite fragile. It's not working well. There is no good tracing of cases. Of course, not only because of that, there is also a lot of failure from the government, and MSF has spoken out about how the Brazilian government has really not done any kind of good coordination, have done a lot of disinformation campaign, and many decisions that really were not helpful and were not based on science, not based on public health. And this has, of course, created a humanitarian catastrophe in Brazil that we could feel more in the second wave that happened this year from January until April, May, more or less. And we had in different states of Brazil a very terrible situation in hospitals collapsing, lack of oxygen, people dying without oxygen, people dying without basic anesthetics and other kinds of drugs for intensive care. And now we are approaching a third wave, so it's quite concerning, considering that vaccination remains slow in Brazil. What will happen in the next weeks when specialists are pointing out to a third wave, and we are still kind of under the effects of the second wave, and in many states the hospital capacities are close to 90%. So in these conditions, if we have a third wave, it will be really disastrous, because there are not now spaces on hospitals. So if cases are increasing in the coming weeks, it would be terrible. And a lot of people actually die without even reaching the hospital, and they are not even notified by the system, because they never got admitted to a hospital. So they are invisible to the calculations. So yeah, that's something we are trying to avoid, and we have been pushing Brazilian government, of course, to support the waiver. And Brazil was actually against, which was a big surprise for other developing countries, and maybe not so much for us from civil society, because we know the current government, they were quite aligned with the Trump administration that was declared. So they followed the Trump administration position on the waiver since the beginning. And now Brazil became isolated when the US actually changed its position. The other countries from the BRICS, for example, China, India, Russia, also kind of are supporting the waiver, and Brazil became isolated. And actually, the European Union approached Brazil to support their this meaningless proposal that they have done. And we have done intensive pressure in Brazil through different means, public opinion pieces, campaigns, petitions, especially in the last weeks, to request Brazil not to join the European Union proposal and support the waiver instead. And finally, last week, Brazil changed its position and declared that they will support the waiver. But we are still to see how the government will behave in the tax negotiations, because that's a crucial moment where governments need to find a consensus on the best tax possible. And we are not so confident that Brazilian diplomats are fighting for that right now. So let's see and keep doing our pressure from here as well. But as others have said, now there's a moment of important pressure over the European countries that are maybe the ones that are creating more delays and blocking this to come true in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Felipe. Next question is to Francisco. Is there opposition to the TRIPS waiver coming from the Colombian government? And yeah, it's to you, Francisco.
The short answer is yes. The Colombian government during the Trump administration was very keen, very obedient to the Trump instructions in these diplomatic issues. And during the elections in the United States and after the elections, the position of Colombia moves to be very silent and very quiet, very tactic in some way, in order to avoid this frontal opposition. In some moment, Colombia decided to support a proposal from Norway and 10 other countries to try to find some kind of intermediary option, intermediary solution, by using voluntary licenses, but not the voluntary licenses that were discussing in the CTAP proposal, in the proposal from the government of Costa Rica, or the proposal from the patent pool, which are voluntary licenses publicly and transparently negotiated and administrated and discussed, and non-exclusive, open, and things like that. We were discussing at the proposal of these countries and the initial proposal of the new director of WTO was to use voluntary commercial, classical commercial licenses between the enterprises and any other producer everywhere. So Colombia supported this proposal, and right now, as far as we know, they abandoned this position, and right now they are silent. No a single word, no anything. We, with a lot of other organizations in Colombia, working from human rights and access to medicines, asked the government to inform to the public what is the position of the Colombian government in this discussion. And we asked more or less 2 months ago, and we insisted, and there is no official answer until now, which is illegal, because in Colombia, when you ask formally for an information about public decisions, it's usual that you have an official answer no more than 1 month after you present the question. It's a right of information. And there is no answer. We are in an emergency, COVID-19 and things like that. And the government is not doing anything in this issue. It's interesting because we had an internal discussion. There is no document, there is no official statement, nothing to affirm what I'm going to affirm, which is that Colombia negotiated with Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca and other enterprises to obtain vaccines out of COVAX facility. And some people is arguing that maybe, and there is no proof, there is no official communication, that they put a condition to the government of Colombia to oppose the waiver in order to obtain vaccines out of these global negotiations of COVAX. There is no proof, but there are a lot of reasons to suspect this issue.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rossi. So I have another quick question for Felipe. Nancy Hansen asked what the name of the U.S. group that's been able to do some work in Brazil, help out in Brazil on some of this stuff.
Well, no, I mean, there are many U.S. groups like Public Citizen, KEI, that are providing different kinds of supports. But in Brazil, there is also a big coalition of NGOs doing this kind of direct pressure in the government and also campaigning. And also in Brazil, there is a lot of work in the Congress at this stage because we are also using this moment to improve our intellectual property legislation, to create better compulsory license provisions, to remove provisions that were extending the term of patents in Brazil in the Supreme Court. This was something that happened last month. It was a big victory for the access to medicines movement in Brazil. So yeah, we feel this is also a moment to regain ground that was lost to pharmaceutical company lobby, because in our laws there are many bad functionings, bad clauses that were created only because there was pressure from those companies, and now we are trying to regain the ground. And compulsory license, for example, is something that the governments normally don't use because they suffer pressure from companies. So we feel that compulsory license should be in the hands of people. It should not be a decision of the governments. They should be wide in scope and used regularly, especially during pandemics, and not depend on the government or the president. They should be a state policy that happens automatically when there is a need. So that's the kind of change we're trying to create in Brazil, also in the parliament, and with some success, because we had a law approved in the Senate that says something like this, and also oblige companies to share the knowledge they have, the biological materials they have, and if they don't, the regulatory agency can do so. So there are innovations that we can also create in the legislations at this moment in our countries to make sure the power comes back to people when it comes to access to medicines, and doesn't depend on companies' willingness or the government's decisions and preferences.
Thanks so much. So we have another question for Arthur. What is the role the international community has played in this fight, and how important is international solidarity?
I mean, the international community has played a huge role, and international solidarity is what has gotten us as far as we have gotten. This is a proposal by India and Brazil and South Africa initially. Very quickly, countries in Africa and less developed countries came on board with that proposal and pushed it forward. And only because of the sort of slow building momentum behind it did campaigners in the United States recognize, hey, wait a minute, this is something that people actually need and want and are calling for, and that we can help deliver now that we've had a change of administration here. And, as we move forward now, our partners in Europe are doing the work that people in other countries have been doing to try to push their governments to support this waiver and get it done. So it's absolutely, it has taken international solidarity, and it's going to continue to take international solidarity to move us forward. And again, in the US, just because President Biden and his administration, said they support a waiver of some type, doesn't mean that our work here is done. We need to be pushing our government to support a comprehensive waiver, like Felipe outlined, not just patents, but all forms of intellectual property standing in the way of increased production, and not just vaccines, but also treatments and diagnostics and other technologies. And we need to do that while also doing what we can to isolate Germany.
Thanks. We have another question. Is data being collected on the amount of vaccine wastage at walk-in, no appointment vaccine sites in the US? The doses have to be pre-thought without knowing how much demand. If they're unused doses at the end of the day, they're discarded, I assume. I drove past a mass vaccination site that resembles a ghost town. It would be obscene if it would be an obscene amount of wastage when the rest of the world is in dire need. Do you know anything about that data? Are we collecting that, Arthur?
I mean, I could just respond quickly that yes, it's absolutely obscene that we're in this point in the United States where we're, struggling not to waste vaccines when there's such dire need, virtually everywhere else on Earth for them. And certainly we should be doing everything we can to make sure that vaccines are treated as, the life-saving critical goods that they are, and that we're not wasting them. And we should be donating as much as we can. But, as I said earlier, the current production levels are nowhere near what's needed to meet the global demand. So we need these massive, these big policy changes, these important policy changes, followed by investment and other moves to increase production as quickly as possible. Just donating more vaccines, just redistributing existing vaccines, just some charitable purchases of some point in the future by the US and the EU is not nearly enough to cut it. We need to basically increase the production, 5-6-fold more. And that's not going to happen without major policy changes.
Thanks, Arthur. And with that, we'll end the Q&A. So after 10 months, as Arthur said, text-based negotiations on the TRIPS waiver finally began today. Now, this is a critical and necessary step towards vaccinating the world and ending the pandemic, but the European Union, led by Germany, continues to obstruct a fast and effective final agreement. And Big Pharma is calling the shots here. In the first 3 months of the year, pharma companies in the United States spent a record $92 million on lobbying. That's just in 3 months. And this is according to data compiled by the Center for Responsive Politics. Now, there's multiple ways in which we can continue to put pressure on the issue. One effective way is playing an important role in the international campaign. Or what important way is bird dogging? Oh, wait, sorry. Francisco, did you raise your hand? You want to say
but it was about the other obscenity we are facing right now in our countries, which is the invitation to go to Miami or New York to obtain the vaccine you can obtain in your country. And we are talking about the situation in Honduras. Honduras is very proud because 70 people, rich people in Honduras, is traveling to Miami to obtain for free, which means the reactivation of the tourism in the United States because of the scarcity of the vaccines. This is obscene. It's amazing obscene. But maybe you were moving to other discussion, which is really important.
No, I think your point is very, it's very important. We need to continue to put pressure on this issue. And so one effective way that's been, playing an important role in the international campaign for the TRIPS waiver is bird dogging. So bird dogging is putting elected officials, candidates, corporate executives, and other decision makers on the spot, in person and on camera, so that they do the right thing. So as Arthur mentioned, next week there will be a training for activists on this tactic. So you could go to the URL he pasted or tinyurl.com/tripsnow to sign up. So we'll be pasting that link on social media and on Zoom so that folks can sign up. So this training will include discussion of the actions around the country during German Chancellor Angela Merkel's July visit to the United States. And for more ways to get involved in this campaign, we encourage you to follow us on social media at CA Trade Justice. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and also follow Global Exchange on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So with that, thank you for your time, and thanks for coming out to this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good luck.